Hello. Today I'm trying to channel Matilda and I don't know if it's quite working. Let me know in the comments. Although unlike Matilda, I for one would not wear a distinctive brightly coloured ribbon on my way to rob a Miss Trunchbull's house. And that is the difference between me and Matilda. Also, she has magic powers and I don't, so who's the real winner here, let's be honest. Today's video is going to go one of two ways. Either it's going to make you want to run a mile or it's going to be really helpful, so please let me know which one it is. But today I will be talking about 21 books about isolation. As you probably know, the UK is in its third national lockdown because, let's not get into why, but we all know it's one person's fault and we all know who that is. I say one person, but it's really a cohort of like ineffective, incapable, disgusting, compassionless people. The Tories. But before this gets too political, basically we're in a lockdown, it's not great, everyone's feeling a bit lonely, everyone's feeling a bit like, what the fuck, is this not finished yet? And we often turn to books to feel better about our daily lives. I know in the first lockdown I was all about escapism. I just wanted to read anything that was like fantasy that would just whisk me away from this hell. But now I'm kind of in the stage of like acceptance and I kind of want to read about people going through a similar thing as me so I feel less alone, if that makes sense. That's why I said it could go one of two ways. Some people are like, I want to read something about someone that's going through my exact situation so that I can feel better about it and less alone. And some people are like, I want to run a mile from this and I want something that's completely different. Like at the beginning of the pandemic when Contagion was like the #1 movie on Netflix and I was like, really guys? Really? You want to watch a movie about a pandemic? No thanks, I'll just stick on Princess Diarist for the millionth time. Thank you very much. That's how I cope with national crisis. But if you're looking for books about isolation, I have you covered. So without further ado, let's get into the recommendations. First book I have to talk about I finished very recently at the beginning of the year. It was my first read of 2021 and it was 5 stars. We love that. And that is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue by V.E. Schwab. I will talk about this in more detail obviously in my wrap up, but this follows Addie LaRue, who is basically cursed to immortality, but everyone forgets her face after they've met her once they'll forget who she is. So obviously it's a very lonely book. Addie can't maintain friendships, relationships, no one remembers her. She lives this kind of transient ghost-like existence until one day somebody does remember her. And I love this book so much. It was loneliness, but it's loneliness with like a tinge of magic because obviously she's immortal and she's passing through all of these different time periods. We travel from France in the 1700s to like London to New York in present day. There's lots of different cool places. So while reading this I was like feeling the loneliness because obviously Addie's very lonely and it was like, you know, making me feel better about my own loneliness, but then I also got to travel and see the world in different places through her. So it was like the best of both. It was like nice escapism, but also like I could feel it on an emotional level. I read this at a really good time, I think. We also have Things We Say in the Dark by Kirsty Logan, which is a short story anthology, and all of these tales are kind of gothic in nature and they focus on women and female desire and violence and like intrinsically female fear. Female fear. And obviously not all of these short stories are about isolation, but there's an overarching theme of the book that the author is writing these stories whilst isolated in Iceland? Yes. So she's writing these stories from a remote house in Iceland, and throughout the book you get these author's notes that are peppered in and about how the isolation is kind of infecting the stories, and it's really interesting. I really loved it. Very atmospheric, a really good one to read in winter if you're isolated like we all are right now. One that I've harped on enough honestly on this channel is Circe, and you're probably bored of seeing this because it's in all of my recommendation and tag videos, but Circe, you will know by now, is about Circe, who is I don't know if she qualifies as a goddess, but she is banished by one of the Greek gods. I don't know which one. It's not Zeus, it's somebody else. Oh, it is Zeus. Cool. Zeus banishes Circe to this isolated island called Aiaia. And on this deserted island she hones her witchcraft. So she learns about the plants and the animals around her and she just grows her power and she becomes very introspective. A bit like Addie LaRue in the sense that it's about loneliness and isolation and desperation, but it has like the twinge of magic to kind of keep you reading. It's not like too bleak. It's got a little kind of magical twist. Another one I've harped on a lot about recently is Eight Detectives by Alice Pavesi. This is one of my best books of 2020, and it's a wonderful kind of cozy crime genre in the vein of Agatha Christie. But the basic premise of this is that there is a reclusive writer of these iconic crime stories, and then the head of a publishing, and then someone who works for a publishing house wants to republish his anthology, so she goes to this deserted island and meets him, and then basically over the course of the novel they have these conversations, and she finds out that this writer might be hiding something. And so it's not really about isolation, but that is definitely an aspect of the novel about why he ran away and detached from society. And I often think that cozy crime is a very good way to escape, because it is just, it's ridiculous, but I love it. All these like horrible kind of villainy characters and like all of these twists and turns. It's definitely one to keep you gripped, and definitely one that if you want to escape the world for a while, this will help. A bit of a blast from the past is We Were Liars by E. Lockhart, and this isn't really about isolation because there are a lot of characters in this book, but it takes place on this kind of it's not a deserted island, but it's like a mysterious like island. So this family owns a house on this kind of remote island, and it's about the kind of family drama, and you know, the grandfather dies or is dying, and then the daughters are like fighting over who gets the house, and then their children, the teens, are just like living their lives and falling out and falling in love, and it's just very atmospheric. It's kind of claustrophobic, everyone's in each other's pocket, and it's this kind of rich, moneyed, opulent existence of these kind of like spoiled teens, and it just follows what happens. And I remember just being enamored with this book when I read it at like 15, and I forced a lot of my friends to read it. It's just hypnotic, that's the best way I can describe it. There it is, Beechwood Island. There's a cool little map as well, love that. We then have The Loneliest Girl in the Universe by Lauren James, which is obviously about the loneliest girl in the universe. This follows Romy Silvers, and she is the only surviving crew member on her spaceship. So she is just stranded in space, kind of, and she's the only surviving crew member, and something obviously bad happened to the rest of her crew. You don't know what that is at the start of the novel, and you just follow her on the spaceship, and she is alone, and she's kind of in touch with this base on Earth, and then they stop communicating with her, and she obviously panics, and then she's like very alone. Another aspect of this novel that I love is that when she's alone in space, she obviously has access to like Earth files, and she like watches a lot of this one show and then writes fanfic about it, and I just love that. I love that something that's so stereotypically teen exists in like a very alien environment. Like she's just in space, just being a normal teenager. I just love that about it. I remember being a bit let down by the ending, but honestly I finished this in less than a day because I was so compelled and I just had to finish it. So if you want an escapist book but also has the kind of isolation theme, this is another one that would be great for that. Another book I've harped on a lot about is Death in Her Hands by Tessa Moshfegh, and this follows an old woman who on a walk with her dog finds a note, and the note says, I've read this note out so many times now, I'm like, I almost know it by heart. Her name was Magda. Nobody will ever know who killed her. It wasn't me. Here is her dead body. See, I got it down. I think the next time I can do it without looking. And then obviously she looks around, there's no dead body, so then she gets obsessed with finding out who wrote this, who is this Magda person, did someone kill her, what's going on. But the whole novel takes place in this woman's head, and she's a very unreliable narrator, and she kind of gets so obsessive about this note and what's happening that you just start to doubt her sanity, like whether or not this note is even real. But it's very atmospheric, very interesting, and it leaves you wanting more. It's not a satisfying novel in the slightest, but it is one that is very interesting, and it's more about a character study of the woman rather than like a whodunit mystery type novel. The next one I have is The Boy, the Mole, the Fox and the Horse, which again, I'm sure you've heard about. It was literally everywhere when it came out and I had no idea what it was. But it's this lovely kind of illustrated book. A lot of people compare the style of it, oh my god, I can't even hold it, to like Winnie the Pooh. But basically it's not very plot driven at all. It's just these beautiful illustrations and like very limited text. And it's this boy, a mole, a fox and a horse, and they're just going on this journey and you're not entirely sure where they've come from or where they're going. And that's why I think it's quite good for, you know, isolation, because obviously they're not isolated, they're all together. I'd say it occupies quite a liminal space, like you don't know where they've come from, you don't know where they're going. A lot of the writing is about the journey and, you know, life and you know, lessons and things like that. So I think it is quite a liminal book, and I think that kind of embodies the feeling of like loss and isolation and kind of being in limbo. And I think that's how a lot of us feel at the moment, is that, you know, we can't move on to the next part of our lives because of the pandemic, and we can't really cling on to stuff that we had before because we're not allowed to. So I think it might be quite good to return to in a time like this, when it is about being in transition and being okay with that. The next book I have is Lily Alone by Jacqueline Wilson. And Jacqueline Wilson has been living in my head rent-free ever since we announced our readathon that we're hosting in February. And if you didn't see that video, it's my last video, you should go and check it out. I announced a readathon that I'm co-hosting, the Wilsathon, where in the week of February 13th to the 20th, we are going to be reading everything Jacqueline Wilson and talking all about Jacqueline Wilson, and it's very exciting. Because it's a Jacqueline Wilson novel, I must have got it and then inhaled it on the day that I got it, because that's what I always did when I was a kid with Jacqueline Wilson. It was like, acquire the book, inhale the book in a day, and then wait a year for the next one. That was just the routine. But from memory, this follows Lily, who is 6 years old? She's young. Yeah, she's 6 years old, and then her mum goes off on holiday with her boyfriend, like, you know, all good mothers do. It's a Jacqueline Wilson novel, so you know that the grown-ups are going to be, like, not great. And then Lily is left alone to look after her 3 younger siblings. So she's not isolated, but she's left alone, abandoned by her mother, and she's left with the responsibility of looking after her siblings. And it's about how that goes. And honestly, I don't know much else about it, but I recommend it because it's Jacqueline Wilson. There's a few more on my list that I don't have to hold up because I am lazy, and they're probably in the back of my bookshelf, and laziness, we love, we stan. There's also The Shining, which I do own, I just can't be bothered to get it out. We all know what The Shining is about. Man goes crazy in an isolated environment. That might not be a great one actually for lockdown. I don't know, but if you read The Shining because of this video and then kill your family, don't blame me. Would that hold up in court? Maybe. There's also Room by Emma Donoghue, which follows a mother and a young child who are basically locked in this basement shed. So the mother, when she was a teenager, got lured and kidnapped by this gross man and raped, and she has this young child, and they are basically trapped in this kind of basement shed area at the hands of this abusive, horrible man, and it's about them trying to escape. But the book is told from the perspective of the 5-year-old kid, which I think is really interesting, and I remember really enjoying that book at the time. And I also really recommend the movie starring Brie Larson because she's incredible in it, and also it's directed by Lenny Abramson, who directed Normal People, if that is something you enjoy, so do check it out. There's also Uprooted, another book that I own that I can't be bothered to get out, and this follows a young girl who lives in this tiny village, and the village is presided over by this wizard who lives in a tower and protects the village from like beasts that live in the woods. But then every like 17 years, or there's like a cyclical thing, every however many years, he requires a girl from the village to like come and live with him, and you don't really know why. And so then obviously this girl is picked to go and live with him in his tower and is taken away from her family. So again, it's kind of like isolation, but also with like a magic twist, if that's something that you're interested in. There's also The Martian, another book that I own, but it's at the bottom of my TBR pile, so I'm not about to bat on my TBR pile again. And The Martian obviously follows a man in space on Mars, and he is alone. And it also has a movie that is worth checking out, directed by Ridley Scott with Matt Damon, and that is a very fun film. I mean, it's not fun. Actually, it is quite fun. I enjoyed that film a lot. We also have Leave the World Behind, another one that I own. I'm not getting it out. And I haven't read this yet, but this is about a couple staying in a cabin, and then the couple that owns the cabin comes to the cabin and is like, hey, weird stuff is happening. The power's gone out, we need to stay here. And it's basically about them all trapped in this cabin. They don't really know each other. They don't really know if what this couple has told them is true. And it's about like the undercurrent of like distrust and suspicion that like slowly builds throughout the novel. And I'm very excited to read it. And it wouldn't be an Anna video if I didn't mention The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. And this is an anthology of fairy tales that are retold and reimagined by Angela Carter for the new kind of feminist generation. It is wonderfully written. I've spoken so much about how much I love this book, and obviously not all of the stories in this book follow the theme of isolation, but the first and titular story of The Bloody Chamber is a Bluebeard retelling, which a young girl marries this, marquis or this count, and is taken to his vast palace, and then he goes away on business and she is left in this vast castle to explore, and she comes upon a very gruesome discovery and has to work out what to do about it before he gets back. And it's fantastic, and it's atmospheric, and it's beautiful, and I will talk about this book all the time, everywhere, all the time. It's so good. And there are a couple of books on my TBR that I don't currently own and haven't read that I have heard are about isolation. So I'm just gonna read out what the descriptions are, because I couldn't tell you. So first we have Eleanor Ophelia is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, and the description is: meet Eleanor Ophelia. She struggles with appropriate social skills and tends to say exactly what she's thinking. Nothing is missing in her carefully timetabled life of avoiding unnecessary human contact, where weekends are punctuated by frozen pizza, vodka, and phone chats with mummy. So from the sounds of it, it's just like an antisocial woman who then meets Raymond, the bumbling and deeply unhygienic IT guy from her office. And then what happens after that? It might not be about isolation, but when I looked for inspiration for this video, it did come up, so if you've read it, let me know. I also really want to read We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. I don't currently own it, but I really want to get my hands on it at some point, and I honestly think you could put basically any of Shirley Jackson's books in this list. I think her style is very much gothic, atmospheric, and then also introspective, very much focused on this kind of stream of consciousness and the tyranny of our own thoughts and the havoc that they can wreak when we're left alone with them for too long. But the description of We Have Always Lived in the Castle is my name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I'm 18 years old and I live with my sister Constance. And then there's more stuff about her, and then it just says everyone else in my family is dead. Cool. I want to read it. And the next couple of books that I have on this list are not about physical isolation, where you're physically cut off from somewhere and you're physically alone, but books more about mental isolation, sort of, if that makes sense. You'll see what I mean when I tell you about the books, I think. So first of all, we have The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, which is a very famous book about Sylvia Plath's breakdown. She had a very famous breakdown where she went missing and then, checked into a hospital. And The Bell Jar is quite hard to read, but one visual description that always kind of sticks out, and it makes sense because it's where the title comes from, is where she talks about feeling like her head is in a bell jar, and that perfectly, to me anyway, describes what it feels like to be dissociated or experiencing some kind of derealization. And I often get that as a symptom of my anxiety. But this book is about that feeling of feeling disconnected in the world and you don't really have a reason why. So the main character in this book is young, has a lot going for her, is focusing on her career, she's got men that are interested in her, she has a family that's in the picture. She doesn't really have a clear-cut reason for feeling the way she does. And yeah, this might, again, and this is quite a melancholy book, so it might not be the greatest one to read in a lockdown, but if you're interested in the feeling of mental isolation and feeling out of sorts, that's a gross oversimplification, but if you're interested in mental illness and the loneliness that can cause in somebody and in their life, then this is a great book to start with. Also Girl Interrupted by Susanna Kaysen, and I think I actually prefer the film over the book, which is sacrilege, I know, but the film is iconic, it's wonderful, directed by James Mangold with Winona Ryder and Angelina Jolie at the height of their careers. Angelina Jolie actually won an Oscar for her performance in Girl Interrupted, so it is top tier and you should definitely watch if you haven't already. And this follows a girl who thinks herself as kind of just normal and is in sort of denial about how much she's struggling, and she finds herself in a mental institution and she thinks that she's kind of the most normal one there, and she thinks that maybe everyone just feels the way that I feel, but I ended up in here because I spoke about how I'm feeling. And it's a very, I think, interesting and relatable book about mental illness, but also the very fine line between I'm saying something that most people feel, like a general kind of tiredness and displeasure with daily life, and then crossing over into this is worrying and you need help sort of behaviour. Again, not so much about isolation in the sense of physical isolation. She makes a lot of friends in the hospital, and the camaraderie between all of the women, because it's a women's kind of hospital, is like lovely, and those are the kind of lighter moments of the novel. But in another sense, this hospital is kind of detached from real life and the real world, and she has this time on her own to like take stock of her life, and her life is almost on pause while she's in here, and she can kind of try and evaluate how she ended up there, if that makes sense. Another one I have is Normal People by Sally Rooney, which again, not really about physical isolation. It's about a romantic relationship, but it's a very, very lonely book. The main couple in this book spend a lot of the novel apart, and it's always a case of, you know, wrong timing or, you know, miscommunication, and it follows them throughout years as they basically try and move on from each other and then find themselves back together and then apart again. And it's about how life is kind of pulling them in different directions, but they're still thinking of each other and are longing for kind of times past. It's a very compelling novel. I also really recommend the TV show that came out last year. It's beautifully shot, and it very much captures the essence of this novel, and it's very introspective. It spends a lot of time in the characters' heads, and they spend a lot of the novel apart, so even though it's about a romantic relationship and like the chemistry and the love between them, it's a very lonely kind of novel as well. In the same vein as Normal People is Saltwater by Jessica Andrews. Again, not really about isolation in a sense. It's about her life and friendships and stuff, but after university she goes back home to Ireland where her family's from, and she's in that house on her own, and she is kind of looking back at her life, and there are little vignettes of her mum and her grandmother and her family and her friends, and basically why she felt the need to take a break from her life. And in a sense, yeah, there are a lot of characters in this novel and there are a lot of memories that, you know, include a lot of people, but she is alone and looking back on them, and it is a very kind of listless, kind of transient novel where there are like little bits and pieces, and there's just like a sense of kind of loss and almost like disparity. I've talked before about how it's non-linear and it jumps around between timelines and different thoughts and different feelings, and that's kind of what happens when you're alone. You kind of daydream and you think about different things, and you latch on to small moments that might not be significant at the time, and then you think about them later. I don't know, I feel like I'm over explaining it, but read this, it's good. And then we have The Princess Diarist by Carrie Fisher. Again, not about physical isolation, but these are her diary entries from when she was 19 years old and filming a little movie you might have heard of called Star Wars. And for those who don't know, during the filming of Star Wars, Carrie Fisher was having a secret affair with Harrison Ford. And obviously being 19, this is quite a formative time for her. She's filming this film that's about to be huge. She's about to be catapulted to huge, huge fame. She was already sort of known because of her mother, Debbie Reynolds, who was in Singing in the Rain. But obviously Harrison was married at this time, so she can't really talk to anyone about this affair. So she only has her kind of journal to confide in, and there is a sense of kind of loneliness and isolation, and she's in limbo sort of. She's filming this film and she's having this affair and she can't really talk about it, and she's also 19 and is dealing with being 19 and all of the kind of struggles that come with that, and she's thinking about her future and what she wants, and these diary entries kind of capture that kind of moment in time where she's like just on the cusp. And I feel like that is kind of how we feel at the moment with like COVID and everything. It's like we were on the cusp but we're not quite there yet, and I don't know, it just made me think of this book, so I really recommend this. I love this book so much. So those are all the books I have for you today. I hope you're doing okay in this current lockdown, and if you're wanting to read about isolation and loneliness in order to feel less alone, I hope one or more of these books are helpful. Please let me know if you have any recommendations for me on books about this topic, or if you have any other good like comfort book recommendations. I would love to hear them in the comments, and I will see you soon with another video soon. Bye.